Hi, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel where your host, moi, takes you through every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X. On today's episode, we're continuing our journey through the Genesis/Mega Drive library specifically, and just to give a count update, this is the 53rd game in that library that I've looked at, if you include Tetris and Darius on the Genesis Mini, which I am, because especially in the case of Darius, that is a fantastic example of what can be done on base Genesis hardware. This week's game is also a port of an arcade game, and actually it's of a similar vintage to Darius, with both games lighting up the arcades beginning in 1987, and specifically on June 19th, 1987, for RoadBlasters. RoadBlasters is a much simpler game than Darius, though, and as such was much easier to port to the Genesis. The reason for this is because RoadBlasters was the last game released for what Atari called their System 1 arcade hardware, not to be confused with Sega's own System 1 arcade hardware. With Atari's System 1 design, Atari was trying out a new modular concept whereby the bulk of the arcade board would stay the same, but a machine could be converted to a different game simply by changing add-on boards, very similar to a home console. Atari followed up the System 1 with a System 2, which were not compatible, but games for both systems appeared in the arcades between 1984 and 1987, with RoadBlasters becoming the last game released for System 1. I actually had no idea about any of this before this week, and I really like when I enjoy something new doing these reviews, which seems like almost every week, and I hope you do too. RoadBlasters is a pretty unique game. You could describe it as a third-person version of Spy Hunter, and that would be somewhat accurate. The arcade version, whether it was the stand-up or sit-down version, had buttons on the steering wheel that were used for firing the guns mounted to your car, as you would need to destroy enemy vehicles in your path, not because they're in your way, although they are, but because they drop precious fuel, and without collecting that fuel, there's a good chance you won't be able to make it more than a few levels in. Based on how vital fuel is to your success, the fact that you're driving around in a super-modified muscle car, the amount of action on screen from blowing up other vehicles, and the futuristic post-apocalyptic background of the game, it's very easy to see how RoadBlasters was inspired by the Mad Max series of films, with the last film in the original trilogy, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, coming out about 2 years before the arcade version in 1985. Your vehicle in RoadBlasters, while being red instead of black, shares more than a passing resemblance to Max Rockatansky's Ford Falcon GT Pursuit Special, not to mention the Road Warrior-esque look of your character on the cover. Not surprisingly, with that concept, RoadBlasters was a legitimate hit in the arcades and was one of Atari's last major hits. Due to this, the game was ported to the usual gaming home computer formats, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad, CPC, Atari ST, Amiga, and Commodore 64, and then was followed up with ports to the NES, Atari Lynx, which was one of the flagship games on the console, and the version we're talking about today on the Genesis, but only in the United States and Japan, as it was never released for the Mega Drive in Europe. No idea what happened there. I can only assume there was some issue with PAL functionality. So, RoadBlasters was an arcade hit on hardware similar to the Genesis, and it had a cool concept. But is the Genesis port actually any good? And why isn't this port more popular? Well, we'll try to answer all that and more, but first, our customary look at the package. And this is RoadBlasters, and this copy is in pretty decent shape physically. Looking at the outer case, the clear cover is fully intact with barely any scratching or marks, and the hang tab is intact at the top of the case. For the most part, the inner cover is fully intact as well, with no sun bleaching. There's a little staining at the top of the rear cover that I can only assume is from some sort of liquid, but you can only barely see it after I clean it up. And if the rear cover wasn't on a white background, you wouldn't be able to see it at all. As far as the front cover goes, I love it. I don't even mind the red Tengen cross logo that they used for most of the time during the Genesis era, as it matches with the red on your car, and the cross resembles a targeting reticle, which goes with the shooting action. This artwork is actually original to the Genesis version, and I didn't realize this until doing the review, but the arcade version actually uses artwork that was used for the NES version instead. And that artwork is cool, don't get me wrong, but I vastly prefer the art used on this version. I'm not sure if I'd call this cover iconic as far as Genesis is concerned, but it's definitely up there. On the spine, just a quick note, All the Tengen Genesis games from this time period looked like this, with the big yellow block letters and then the red line and Tengen at the bottom, so they stand out immediately when you look at them on your shelf, and this one is no different. Moving over to the back, and it's got the same standard Tengen white background, which I'm not in love with, but I also recognize it could be a lot worse, and at least the text is easier to read, although there's a lot of it and no bullet points. They probably could have done a little better job on the flavor text, as no one picking up a game wants to read a novel to figure out if they should buy it or not. However, I do like the tagline at the top with "the deadliest race of your life," which really sells it. They also included 4 screenshots below that in a similar format to what they used on Hard Driving. The screenshots are just okay, as they're all a bit blurry, and they commit the party foul of having 2 screenshots from the same level, and none from a level above 11, so you can tell that these were collected pretty quickly without a ton of thought. As I open up the package, the cartridge originally had a sticker on the top of the label, which I hate, but is unfortunately common sometimes when dealing with used games. I cleaned it up as good as I could, but there's only so much you can do before you start to remove the ink from the label, which is just as bad. So, public service announcement time. If you're gonna sell retro video games, don't put price stickers directly on the cartridges. Use small post-it notes or bag the cartridges in Mylar bags. But if you have to put stickers on a cartridge, don't put them on the label portion. Please. The manual is in pretty good shape. It's got a slight bend on the right side, which isn't too unusual, but the rest of the manual has held up well. Unfortunately, even though it's in good condition, there's not much here to be proud of. It's not the 4-page disaster that Hard Driving was, but it's not much better. Not a single screenshot, and even though this is a relatively simple game that's easy to explain, they totally left out the options screen. It's not a huge deal, and the options screen is relatively self-explanatory, but come on, the manual is only 6 pages as is, and there's plenty of free space. This is just sloppy. Okay, well, that's the slightly underwhelming package. Let's see if the game itself feels like it had a bit more effort put into it. As I mentioned earlier, RoadBlasters on the Genesis is based on the arcade original from Atari that came out in mid-1987, but this version of the game didn't appear until a full 4 years later, in August of 1991, and then 6 months later in Japan with no PAL release. Which begs a few questions like, why did it take 4 years to port the game to the Genesis? And why was the game never released in Europe, even though other Tengen Genesis Mega Drive releases were, and it certainly appeared on all the common home computers in Europe? Well, I don't have any answers for the latter, but as far as the first part of that is concerned, Tengen didn't start releasing games for the Genesis until mid-1990, so when you take that into consideration, RoadBlasters isn't that late a release. However, one thing about Tengen taking their time with releasing RoadBlasters is that they gave their developers some time to learn the Genesis hardware. And I can definitely say that any problems RoadBlasters has aren't related to the quality of the port, by and large. Along with having some time to learn the ins and outs of the hardware, Sterling Silver Software benefited from the design of the original Atari System 1 arcade, which utilized a Motorola 68010 clocked at 7 MHz as its main CPU, and a Yamaha YM2151 as one of its sound processors, and ran at a resolution of 336 by 240, which was just barely higher than the Genesis 320 by 224. Now, obviously, that's not exactly what a Genesis is packing under the hood, but it's certainly close, and I'm sure the programmers at Sterling Silver Software appreciated that. As a result, RoadBlasters for the Genesis is impressively close to the arcade original. It's certainly not exactly the same, as if you look more closely, you can tell how the arcade game features an expanded color palette, which allows for more than 64 colors on the screen at a time, but it certainly does not use a lot more than that, and the arcade version appears to run just slightly smoother. But again, this is a minor difference, and unless you were comparing the two directly together, side by side, you probably wouldn't notice. The original arcade version also featured 2 other sound coprocessors, with one of them being used for digitized speech that pops up in status messages. The Genesis version doesn't bother to try and emulate that speech in-game, and I think it's the correct decision. The reason why I say this is because the audio speech samples that are in the game are pretty horrid. Seeing as how the Atari System 1 arcade hardware had extra hardware to process these effects, I really can't explain why they're so poor. Adding them to the Genesis version would have certainly been doable, but I've mentioned before that any kind of FM-based effects have a significant memory cost, especially if you want them to sound good. So I can see why they were dropped, as they really didn't add anything to the game. RoadBlasters features a very simple concept. Race your souped-up car through 50 levels, or rallies as they're called in-game, and you win. In the original arcade version, you could actually earn a RoadBlasters t-shirt if you managed to complete the game before a certain date, by sending in a code that the game would give you. Of course, finishing 50 levels takes not only a considerable amount of time, but also persistence, a bit of luck, and more than likely a lot of quarters. RoadBlasters the arcade machine allows you to keep continuing as many times as you want as you make your way to level 50, so if you fail to complete a rally, you can just pop in a quarter and try again. That is, until the last level. Atari apparently was incredibly devious when they designed RoadBlasters and set things up so that you only had one chance at passing level 50. Run out of gas before the finish line on that final rally, and there's no continuing. It's just time for you to put your name on the high score list and start over from scratch. Pretty evil, if you ask me. This is where the Genesis version of RoadBlasters probably has its biggest diversion with the arcade machine. Rather than having infinite continues on the Genesis, instead you only have 5. 5 continues to get through 50 levels changes things dramatically, and ramps up the difficulty level to a ridiculous point. And the one shot at level 50 rule is intact, so even if you're crazy enough to get all the way to level 50 on only 5 continues, well, you better start praying. To me, the difficulty's too much. I get the argument that allowing infinite continues would make it too easy to get to level 50 as well. You just have to have patience at that point and be incredibly stubborn. But in the time that I played it for the review, I can't imagine just how good someone would have to be at the game to make it there while only allowing 5 screw-ups. Just a quick note, the Genesis version also includes a practice mode where you can't get blown up, but you can still die if you run out of gas. This mode is useful if you want to see what some of the higher levels look like, but can't get there normally. I can't imagine anyone would put too much time into it though. I've gotten a bit ahead of myself, as I haven't discussed what you're actually doing during a rally that makes the game difficult to complete. It goes without saying that you're racing from point A to point B. That's usually the point of a race. However, in this futuristic existence, time isn't what's stopping you from advancing to the next level, it's fuel. Your car is designed with 2 gas tanks, a main tank and a reserve tank. As you drive, your total gas will deplete at a constant rate, whether you have your car wide open and are burning down the track, or whether you're stopped and are simply burning because you got blown up by an enemy, wasting precious fuel that you desperately need to get to the finish line. Your main tank will refill if you manage to make it to the midpoint of each level, and you can earn more fuel by either running over green globes which appear on the track, or red globes that appear randomly when you destroy an enemy vehicle, with the red globes giving more fuel, but are ultimately harder to come by. If you burn through your main tank before reaching the checkered flag, you'll start to use fuel in that reserve tank, which is not only smaller than your main tank, but you also only refill it by how many points you score during a level, and that fill-up only occurs at the end of a level. It's not constantly adding fuel when you blow things up. It's all great in theory, and for what was originally an arcade machine designed to separate quarters from their owners, it provides some great quality action while allowing players to chase high scores and give them an actual goal to achieve, rather than just aimlessly clear screen after screen. The problem is the actual gameplay hasn't aged very well. To gain a high score, you must keep your multiplier up, which is done by shooting enemies in a row without missing. Thankfully, if you miss a shot, you only go down 1 notch for each miss, rather than resetting all the way back to 1x. But unless you have the Uzi bonus weapon, you'll end up being very judicious about only shooting enemies you think you can hit, since getting a high score is the only way to earn that valuable reserve tank fuel. This is a problem because your gun isn't terribly accurate unless you're firing straight ahead, and even then, sometimes you'll have to wait until an enemy is just ahead of you, or else you'll risk missing your shot to the left or the right,
which then ends up with you blowing up due to plowing directly into the back of the enemy. This becomes increasingly infuriating as you go up through the rally levels, as the further you go, the more enemies you'll have to make your way through. The Genesis version does include a nice tweak to the controls and offers you an alternate control scheme where your car automatically accelerates, so you don't have to worry about holding down the gas, and can concentrate on just the shoot button or the special weapon button. But it's just a slight convenience and doesn't really help through the difficult moments, such as trying to hit someone while turning. From a graphics perspective, if you keep in mind that it's originally a game from 1987, it doesn't look bad at all. And without question, the Genesis port of RoadBlasters is by far the most faithful to the arcade machine, even when taking into consideration the Atari ST and Amiga versions, that both appear to have serious frame rate issues and redrawn sprites for some reason. For any racing game, it's a must that the action on screen is always fluid and quick, and the Genesis has no problems with that. Even though the rally levels don't offer much in the way of differentiation between each other, except for a steady increase in difficulty, each level at least features a different color scheme in the background, and every few levels the scenery at the back of the screen changes to reflect entering a new area, and if you're curious, those areas are spelled out in the manual. The scenery can be a little ugly in places, and this is one of those times when the Genesis 64 on-screen color limit hurts it, but it's fine for the few times that you'll have to look up from the action directly around your car, and it resembles the arcade machine as close as it does everywhere else. I think I was most impressed in the game from an audio perspective. That might seem a little odd to hear, especially with my earlier comment about how the speech was removed from the game, but all the sound effects that remain in the game sound good, and the background music is fantastic. Apparently, while the rest of the game was developed by the staff at Sterling Silver Software, all the audio was done by Earl Vickers, who had worked with Atari for years, and also contributed to other Tengen releases on the console. The game doesn't have a ton of different music tracks, only about 5 or 6, but they all sound great. The tracks are full of energy, up-tempo, and match the on-screen action. Most of the time during the races, there is no background music, but it kicks in when you get close to the end of a race, and as soon as you hear it, you know it's time to hang on tight. RoadBlasters the arcade machine is an all-time favorite of mine, and that goes back to playing it at the skating rink I used to visit during the summers in elementary school. Playing it 30 years later with a fresh set of eyes, I still appreciate it for what it was in the summer of 1987. But I also recognize that things have changed a lot since then. And I've also figured out that once you hit level 15 or so, the game actually gets a little boring, because you're just doing the same thing over and over with different waves of enemies on slightly different tracks. And the Genesis version is about as good a port of the game as you could ask for, pre-32-bit era. However, due to time and the sheer difficulty of the game, it's lost a bit of its luster for me. As a result, I'm giving RoadBlasters on the Genesis 2 stars. Even though it hasn't really aged well, it's got a great concept, and having any kind of arcade near-perfect port in 1991 is a nice technical achievement.
Okay, that was RoadBlasters. I like reviews like this, because going into this review, I remembered really liking this game from the arcades, and I was looking forward to playing a home version of it. It turns out that I thought the game was just okay, but that's not because the Genesis version is bad. Instead, the Genesis version just opened my eyes to the fact that the arcade version wasn't nearly as good as I remembered it. And it's nice to have a now accurate version of the game that isn't rose-tinted, so to speak. Next week on Zilog and Moto, well, I'm not going to give a hint about the game. I'm just going to come right out and say what it is. I don't have my main Genesis back from being recapped yet, but what I do have now is this. This is a mono SCART cable for the Sega Master System, so I can play Master System games now without having to rely on my power base converter. So I'll be going back to the previously scheduled Asterisk that was supposed to be reviewed back in episode 81. I'm going to use Asterisk as a trial run because the Master System is unfortunately bad about jail bars when using SCART, so this might be my last Master System review until my other gear is repaired, depending on how bad the jail bars are. We shall see. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.